talk is titled The First Woman Rabbi of the 20th Century and will be presented by Rabbi Leah Novick. Rabbi Leah Novick has been on the Central Coast for decades and is known for her love of nature and good films. Rabbi Leah has been a student and teacher of Jewish mysticism for over 30 years. She enjoys sharing her insights from ancient wisdom with people from all backgrounds. Ordained in 1987, Leah specializes in the role of the feminine seven, divine and human, in Judaism. She is the author of On the Wings of Shekinah, Quest 2008, and a CD of guided meditations. While one of the oldest women rabbis, she continues to study and teach Jewish mysticism and lead guided meditation. My dear friend, Rabbi Leah.
Good morning. I hope to be with you. And of course, we are all so lucky to have this platform so we can at least be together technologically. What I wanted to share with you this morning is a little bit about the life of an extraordinary young woman whose dedication and altruism continues to illuminate the way for many who followed her. And unfortunately, we didn't follow her until about the 1970s, but we did catch up. So I'd like you to picture the setting in which Regina Jonas emerges. She grows up in a poor Orthodox family in Berlin at a time when Germany is experiencing a kind of cultural renaissance. Very lively art, music, theater, and a great deal of ferment in the religious groups towards what is called liberalism at that time. So in the Jewish community, this is where Reform Judaism with its emphasis on social action emerges. It is also the time that the Jüdische Frauenbund, a Jewish feminist group, grows under the leadership of Bertha Pappenheim. They had over 30,000 members, which is really, to me, astonishing. So this young woman, whose father died sort of the end of the First World War, was taught first by her father and then by Orthodox rabbis who believed in educating girls. It was really an important time for women to start coming into education and to more professionalism in the Jewish community. From the time she was in high school, people knew that she wanted to be a rabbi. And she was very fortunate that she got to study Talmud and Jewish law, a lot of areas that we continue to discuss until the 1980s as to whether they were appropriate for women. Interestingly enough, one of her teachers was Leah Beck, who was one of the great lights of Reform Judaism, not only in Germany, but later in the United States, a great writer. And when Regina entered the Hochschule, which was a training for both teachers and rabbis, I think that he and others knew that she wanted to be a rabbi, even though all the other women in the program were training to be teachers. And so she did the whole pathway to ordination, what we call in Hebrew smicha. She took all the classes, she did all the papers, and she eventually wrote her thesis on the issue of Jewish law allowing women to be rabbis. She studied what we call halakha, Jewish law, because she was still very orthodox in her practice, although she was studying in a progressive school. And so she did all of the work that would have been necessary for ordination. And unfortunately, her thesis advisor died before she could get ordained. And the rabbi who filled in for him was not comfortable ordaining women. In fact, even the great Leo Beck was not ready at that point, that would have been around 1930, to be the first. They were concerned about keeping the Jewish community unified at a time that fascism was starting to really be much more obvious, even to the world. But certainly to those who were living in Germany, there was the issue of community cohesiveness. And that issue really continued for a very long time. So what she did was she began teaching and wherever she could. And she usually got work in nursing homes, facilities for senior citizens, hospitals, and so on. However, she never gave up studying. And so in 1935, in fact, on Christmas Day of 1935, Rabbi Max Dinnemann, who was a liberal German rabbi, ordained her and spoke of her faith and her knowledge of Jewish law and her capacity to serve. First slide. If I confess what motivated me, a woman, to become a rabbi, two things come to mind: my belief in God's calling and my love of humans. God planted in our heart skills and a vocation without asking about gender. Therefore, it is the duty of men and women alike to work and create according to the skills given by God. And so she proceeded to take work as a rabbinical counselor. And from about 1935 on, situation for German Jews worsened. Many people who were able left the country. And so she was often drafted by the regional councils to come and speak, to teach, to preach, and so on. And so from the period of about 1937 through 1941-42, that's what she was doing. She traveled a great deal. And at one point, she was actually in a forced labor factory as well. That was in 1941. But earlier on, say from about 37 through 40, she was able to reach a great many people. And in the course of her travels, she met a widowed older rabbi, Joseph Norden, and they really fell in love with each other. But given the political situation and perhaps the difference in their ages, it never came about. He wrote to her telling her how much he loved her and that if he were younger and different circumstances, he would have asked her to marry him. He already had 4 children. His wife had died, and some of his children actually survived the concentration camps and were quite active politically. So we know about him, we know about Rabbi Regina, because in 1942, when things were getting worse, she gave Rabbi Norden some of her papers to deposit in an archive in East Berlin. She must have had great foresight. And unfortunately, in 1942, she and her elderly mother were deported to Theresienstadt. And shortly thereafter, Rabbi Norden was also deported. What we don't know is whether they ever saw each other again in the camps. We hope they might have. So I will take the next slide. She said, "The wheel of time turns, moving our world of Jewish thought. And with the general development of humanity and our world, attitudes towards the woman also have developed and changed. So even as her world was collapsing, she still believed that people were changing and that perhaps even in the worst of times, it was an opportunity for people to really look at their own attitudes, at their own actions. And we know that many, many non-Jews helped Jews, helped gypsies, helped the partisans. There were so many people who did assist, and they've been honored, of course, at the Holocaust Museum of Israel at Yad Vashem as righteous Gentiles. Trees have been planted for them, and in recent years, many of them have been featured in films. So she went into Theresienstadt still, I would say, optimistic. Now, Theresienstadt was a unique camp. It was the camp that the Nazis used to convince the Red Cross that the camp was really humanitarian. What they did was they put the most outstanding Jewish intellectuals, musicians, artists, poets into that camp. It's estimated that there were 250 people who gave lectures in that camp. There were orchestras, there were art, art workshops, and so on. However, Rabbi Regina's job was not to entertain. I think we have a Theresienstadt slide. Her job was to meet the trains when the people arrived and to explain to them what was ahead and to provide some comfort and some counseling. Now, this job was part of a group that was established by Viktor Frankl, famous psychoanalyst who did survive and later wrote a great deal about the condition of humanity. She was working with him, and yet, as Marianne pointed out, he never mentioned her in any of his books. He later said that he forgot everything that transpired before the camps, but he certainly was still very intact intellectually. And many of the scholars who have studied Rabbi Regina are convinced that there is an issue of misogyny in that both Viktor Frankl and Rabbi Beck didn't mention her in their writings. Rabbi Beck ended up signing her ordination certificate in 1939 and was one of her supporters and admirers. But neither one of them mentioned her. And other scholars have suggested it was because she was such an independent spirit, that she was too progressive for the Orthodox and too Orthodox for the progressive. And so neither the Reform movement or the Orthodox movements really embraced her. Who did embrace her were European Jewish feminists who came along a lot later. One of them is Rabbi Elisa Klappek, who is a rabbi now in Germany, was formerly a journalist. And Rabbi Elisa found out through a scholar, interesting that Rabbi Regina's papers were found by a Christian scholar, a minister from Maryland named von Kallenbach, whose family had participated, unfortunately, in the Nazi era, one of her uncles. And she was doing research on German feminism, although her family had emigrated to the United States, but she went back to Germany and she found some of Regina Jonas's papers and knew immediately that they were important, drew other people into the research. And because of that research and Rabbi Klappek's extensive biography of Regina Jonas, we really got to know about her contributions. And so a large group of feminists from around the world gathered in Berlin, I think in the early 2000s, not sure about the date. And they essentially used the example that she had set and studied her writings and her papers. And I think it is because of her that we have seen a growth of women rabbis and cantors in Europe. We already had this kind of growth in the 70s and the 80s here in the United States and also in the UK. But Europe was a little different because people surviving from the Holocaust had a mixed view of what kind of Judaism they wanted to reinstitute. In many places in Europe, the tendency was to go back to tradition, and the support was there from Orthodox groups. So it really took, I think, the formation of what was called Beit Deborah, the house of the prophetess Deborah, that centered around Regina Jonas. That was, I think, a stimulant two European women who are now scholars, cantors, and rabbis as well, and making more of an impact on what the future of Jewish culture will look like in Europe. It's interesting that there has been a resurgence of Jewish community in Berlin, some of it even Israelis. So we don't know exactly how and why people are drawn back. Many people go for the March of Life from Auschwitz to Birkenau. Many teenagers go on the March for Life to learn about the Holocaust. But there are others who are drawn back either because of their family roots or some other cultural attachment. There are groups that are restoring the cemeteries in Eastern Europe. There are groups that go and visit the graves of great saints in Europe. Unfortunately, we don't have a grave to visit for Rabbi Regina. She was deported to Auschwitz in 1945 on October 12th. It is believed that she was killed the same day, but since we don't know, my inclination is we will probably celebrate her yahrzeit, the anniversary of her death, on the date that she was sent to Auschwitz. Both she and her mother perished. I'm not sure whether her brother survived, but her memory has been very much enhanced by film. There's a charming film that's been made about her. There's a shorter film called In the Steps of Regina Youngest that some rabbis made. And there is continued interest in her. And if you go online, you'll find quite a bit about her, really. So we lament her passing, but we rejoice in her memory and know that she has had an incredible impact on all of those who have heard about her story, read about her life, seen her in this photo where she is wearing her the kind of robes that they would have worn for the ordination ceremony. I would digress a little bit and tell you that one of the issues that came up around her has continued in a certain way, and that is that those of us who get ordained, what is called privately, by 3 rabbis ascertaining us, have always had more difficulty in getting posts within large synagogues. To a large extent, within the reform and conservative movements, particularly in this country, there's a tendency to draft rabbis from the seminaries that are well known, because you know who the teachers are, you know what the requirements are. I am part of what's called the Jewish Renewal Movement, and our teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, ordained probably, maybe 100 to 200 of us. But we now have a curriculum, a program, a whole educational structure, although people can do a lot of it in the areas where they live, and they can do some private study, they can do some online study. So we have a program that results in ordination, but it's not quite as well recognized for the purpose of employment. The Reconstruction movement, the Reform movement, conservative movement have seminaries. The modern Orthodox have seminaries. The extreme Orthodox tend to still ordain in the old way, which is that you study for a long time, and it is your teachers who decide whether or not you are appropriate for the rabbinate. And of course, Rabbi Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth, was also ordained in the old way. So that's a sort of an educational issue that has continued. And because Rabbi Regina wasn't officially ordained by her seminary, even in peacetime, she might not have been invited into a large congregation. Although during her travels, She spoke in probably every synagogue in Berlin and was very well received. So her spirit also is one of openness and tolerance, despite the fact that her personal practice was very observant. She would, in our terms, be a modern Orthodox Jew, one who is very open and at the same time very mindful of the law. There are women now being ordained in the Orthodox tradition, some in Israel, some in the United States on the East Coast. They call themselves Rabbi, which is a feminine version of rabbi, whereas the rest of us tend to go. Rabbi, Regina, but use our first names. And so we are thankful for her, and we are appreciative of her, and we hope that her influence continues.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Leah. We appreciate that talk. Normally at this time, we receive offerings from our congregants. However, due to the virtual format of this service, we invite you to make your offering in one of the methods shown on the slideshow. Enlarge the slideshow tile to see how to do this. These methods will also be posted in the newsletter and on the UUCC website itself. Please make note of this. Our thanks for any gifts given and received for the work of this community.